Good morning and welcome back to another episode of There's Something to Think About. In the last few weeks we've been kind of wandering through the minor prophets, taking a thought from each of them and sharing them this morning. And this morning we want to take a look at the prophet Micah and look at God's great requirement. Perhaps the most well-known verses in Micah are especially significant for this Advent and Christmas season. It's the prophet Micah, for example, preaching in the southern kingdom of the ancient Judah somewhere around 720 BC, who tells us where Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, where Jesus will be born 7 centuries later. Micah writes, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace." It is these verses in Micah that sent the wise men from Herod to Bethlehem on their journey to find the one who was born King of the Jews. It is these verses that sent Herod's misguided minions on a killing spree, determined to exterminate the divine king before he could reach maturity and take the throne. It is these verses that give us pause, that call us to realize that God ordained the coming of Christ and all the details of his life long before the world began. It is these verses that tell us that God told of his plan before a single event came to be. These verses beckon us to consider carefully what God has to say to us. For even when what he reveals takes time to be fulfilled, it will most certainly come to pass, just exactly as he declares it. God neither lies, nor misleads, nor deceives us. He does not say one thing and do another. What he says, he does. What he determines, he actualizes. The strength and the power of these prophetic verses demand that we take to heart any instruction that might accompany this particular revelation. Within the prophecy of Micah, there is another verse that we ought to pay close and careful attention to. Since we know that God acted with integrity and fulfilled in Christ the prophetic word given by Micah, when God then tells us how we ought to respond to him, we have every reason to listen carefully and to act diligently. God is not kidding. He means what he says. We might ask this promise-keeping, this prophecy-fulfilling sovereign God, what would you have us do with our lives? That's what Micah is led to ask in chapter 6. He says to God, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high?" And then he goes on to ask a series of questions. Does God want burnt offerings? Does God want thousands of rams offered on the altar and 10,000 rivers of oil poured out in worship? Does God want my firstborn? Will that satisfy God and move him to forgive my sin? The answer to that question, what does God want of me, is simple. We find it in chapter 6, verse 8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. All you have to do, God says, is to think like me, love like me, and spend your life setting yourself aside and becoming like me. Simple, right? Simply impossible. Who can do this? If our best attempt at genuine righteousness is, as Isaiah affirms, filthy rags, then who can adequately do justice the way God does, love the way God does, and set himself to be like God the way God is? Now, we already know the answer to those questions from the earlier verses. Who can do what is good and what the Lord requires? The one born in Bethlehem can. He shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. He shall be their peace. Not only their peace with one another, but more specifically, their peace with God. He will be the one who can fulfill the requirement of God. He will be the one who can do justice to the quality of God's glory, who can love mercy to the extent of God's heart, and who can set himself aside to the infinite fulfillment of God's eternal plan of salvation. The manger, the garden, the beating, the cross, the death, the grave, the resurrection. This is the gospel story of the one born in Bethlehem who fulfills the divine requirements of our sovereign and holy God on our behalf. And we meet those requirements ourselves when we put our trust in Christ, who did for us what we cannot do for ourselves. You and me, we can't make a sacrifice big enough, pure enough, costly enough to cover our own sin, let alone the sin of the whole world. We cannot make an offering for ourselves that will bring us into peace with God. We cannot do enough justice, justly enough. We cannot love mercy, mercifully enough. We cannot humble ourselves to the will of God humbly enough. But the one born in Bethlehem, God come in human flesh, he is enough. In this season of Advent, lay down your burden of trying to be enough. Take up Christ. Take up the one who is God, the one who is enough. Put your faith and your trust in him, and let him lead you into justice, mercy, and humility. Until next time, there's something to think about.